Blessed love and peace in Rastafari. I'm reviewing a recording from earlier today talking about obliteration society, talking about being civilizational healers, medicine people. So an additional joint along these lines. Oh, I know. Don't sweat the technique. Don't. Another Eric B. and Rakim reference. I think that's Eric B. and Rakim. We're going on 40 years now in terms of hip hop. Wow. Eric B. and Rakim is maybe about 38, 36 years in the height, I guess, but most likely already getting active around 40 years ago. Wow. That's like World War II for my generation. Wow. Anyways, a thing to share, additional joint to share. On that topic of obliteration, but also building from another recent reasoning session where there are some surprising proclamations that are shared. It's challenging, it's understandable, but still, it's to be honest, somewhat frustrating, but it's just like somewhat deflating, but at the same time, it's actually helpful. It's sobering and helping us to recognize like further emphasis, further concentration, further resolve concerning solution, and there being less onus, obligation for entertaining ignorance. This is what I'm talking about. When kinfolk are talking about anti-China sentiment, whether it's explicit and outright just vitriol, or whether it's very like subtle, those hidden things of biases, racial references, ethnic references, or whatever, or even just the simple like accusations of China or another quote unquote group, ethnicity, or religiosity that's perceived as foreign, being all types of critical, accusational, condemning of another side for doing the same thing that America does, even further atrociously, but only communicating a vitriol against a foreigner doing it, whether it's violence or dishonesty, unfairness, or whatever. Absolute vitriol. I'll try to like tone it down in that respect. Like categorical vitriol, animosity towards this unscrupulous, or suspect behavior and accusations of a perceived foreign entity. But at the same time, when introduced and reminded of blatant atrocities that the United States is doing at this moment in the same field of egregiousness, atrocities, wrongness, injustices, then it's like, oh, and that's bullshit. It's late, already fatigued. Do have some water. We got some aqua. Lo and behold. That's actually kind of funny. That's funny. All right, let's focus on this joint. Let's complete this joint, God willing. All right. All right, so we're talking about the anti-quote-unquote foreignness. And whether it's liberals who communicate this or it's conservatives, whether it's blatant racist statements or whether it's very subtle, hypocritical criticisms that are not applied to the United States, it's all bullshit. And it's all ignorance. It's a plantation mentality. But it's helpful it's helpful when people articulate it so that we can better know and see where people's minds are at, where people's intentions are, beyond allegiances or whatever. Just recognize, oh, okay, yeah, that's kinfolk that we have to be like, we have to limit how much we expect to build with kinfolk with that. We're not even trying to argue. We're not trying to convince kinfolk. We just see where kinfolk are at, and oh, okay, there it is. There are limitations of how much can be expected accordingly. And not get mad. Don't blame kinfolk. Don't try to punish kinfolk. Don't try to convert, convince, or otherwise. When kinfolk are ready, kinfolk approach accordingly. And when approaching, then kinfolk generally are increasingly receptive to what we share. And there it is, by the grace of the Most High, for us to have that patience and not feel that obligation of being proactive in reconciling with people or otherwise, and instead investing those energies and that materiality to things that are increasingly constructive and immediate and conducive to long-term solutions. So, going back to this topic of the xenophobia. What we observe is that a lot of the xenophobia, when it's communicated from the common kinfolk, even when it's communicated from like the politicians are not the hierarchy. They're hired beings. But even the quote unquote powerful politicians, when articulating, it's not to get mad at whatever, not to get mad at some perceived like impotence of like countering those messages or the mentality, not even to worry about that, and instead focusing on ourselves. Now, what we observe in those situations when kinfolk are explicitly articulating that xenophobia, either explicitly or subtly, what we observe, is it the third time I said that? What we observe is that mentality is very much entrenched within a perceived invincibility of America. Now, oftentimes, to be honest, it's actually the consequence of terrorism from America, such that people are fearful of thinking of anything outside of America as a legitimate authority. So we do recognize that there being severe terror, and people are doing the best they can amidst being very fearful from that terrorism. But by and large, what we observe, as I said before, is a perceived invincibility on the part of American government, the military, money, technology, whatever else. And because there is that perceived invincibility, the sheeple mindset, the domesticated plantation mindset, is basically just to attach the wagons to that perceived front runner, regardless of ethics, regardless of principle, regardless of creeds. Just like, who do we think is going to win? Who do we think is going to be left standing? And let's connect with that kinfolk as much as possible. Now, to be honest, what is estimated, what is generally observed, is that when people are figuring out who's the most likely to be standing after the dust clears, in actuality, and by and large, people might recognize like religious communities being the most likely to endure those conditions, because by and large, religious communities have been doing it for thousands of years already. The difficulty that people observe or seem to experience with that is that to be aligned with those religious communities, it means living a very boring life. Ooh, who wants to do that? Are there any other options for front runners that let us to do what we want to do? Government. Laissez-faire. So there's an increasing proclivity of attaching one's wagons, oneself, to what is perceived as the front-running wagon of the United States, because of the presumption of the United States government being the front runner. And the big government, big military, big guns all around the world, generally speaking. And so the followers, the plantation mentality just attaches it to that. We're talking about any other solutions that are independent from the plantation, even not antagonistic and threatening to overthrow the plantation, but just are different and independent. Then there becomes this response of doubt. I don't know how. I don't know. Might as well just do this and dispersion. So my point here is this. I'm starting to fall asleep again. Last time we did this, we had a situation, so I'm being mindful of this. It's a little bit earlier than it was at that time, but still, we have a vehicle on the move as we speak. I did a very slow turnaround, and now it's signaling like it's leaving. All right, let's work to finish this up before we just start falling asleep woefully. The point here is this: people perceive the United States as being invincible. Particularly, that's how Americans are conditioned to believe. They're drinking. They're all up in the Kool-Aid. They're injecting the Kool-Aid. Kinfolk are injecting the Kool-Aid, and let me pause on how much vitriolic I get on describing this. But the point is that many kinfolk are just so indoctrinated with this notion of exceptionalism and invincibility, and then like are pledging allegiance to that and doubling down in it, and additionally. And when people talk about foreignness, quote unquote, anything outside the United States, part of that doubling down is, oh, we got corporations to take care of that. Oh, we'll take care of TikTok and this, that, and the other, and all this protectionism. That's one way of describing it. Belligerence and ignorance is another way of describing it. Hypocrisy, contradicting the laws of take by precluding others from taking, intrinsically undermines the premise of the United States itself. It's about taking. So to disallow others to take, we're not advocating that. Obviously, that's not our religiosity or otherwise. But when the United States prohibits others to take, the United States is cutting its own foundation, because that's what the United States stands on. And the thing is that the others of the earth are powerful enough to push and shove. America's got a lot of problems, a lot of troubles in this world. So much troubles for the states. It's bullied a lot of things. It's corrupted a lot of things. And all right, let's be constructive. There's a point here. The general principle is that when the United States prohibits other investors, other nations from the United States is fundamentally contradicting itself. The United States is a foreign entity itself, and it establishes itself through conquest, through the power of, the power of the sword turned into the power of the gun. All right. I've already described this generally before on previous occasions, but we'll do it again. Because again, people seem to be, particularly the hard-headed kinfolk, and no hate, no shade, but just the hard-headed kinfolk who just double down and just put their heads deeper into those sands of American exceptionalism and invincibility, the delusions of that. Just stick head further down into it. Mining, piece of mining. Anyway, and refusing to recognize the legitimacy within the observation of the self-annihilistic positioning of such obstructions of quote-unquote foreignness. It works against itself. Now, I've described before basically two scenarios. There's the inevitability, and all right, the one scenario, there are a number of different scenarios, but these are two. One scenario is, how do I put this? Actually, do a few scenarios here. I can actually think of four actually, basic scenarios. One scenario is like the mainstream scenario, where the United States allows, by law, according to its own law, foreign entities, quote-unquote foreign entities, China, Singapore, even India, Israel, Arabia, Qatar, Emirates, Europe, France, Deutschland, Scandinavia, Italia, England, foreign entities to do what the law allows people to do, which is buy property, buy up blocks of property, set up shop, set up cities according to the constitution of state entities. But those cities are different from the rest of American culture, speak different languages and otherwise. That's how America is established. So for America to obstruct other entities from doing it, America undoes itself. It's plain and simple. That's the first scenario of the change of the world, the change of the United States happening through that. Because already America sees it can easily be done in the duration of one moon, to be honest. Transactions and otherwise is being done slow motion and being obstructed in some ways. But it's right at the door. Massive migration, massive transference of title and land. And in that massive migration and population change and that massive transference of land deeds and titles, massive transformation of political leverage nationally and worldwide, translating into local legislatures, municipal as well as state levels, as well as federal. Again, this is all legal. This is all according to the laws. China buying up land. Japan buying up land. Not just land here and there, but blocks of land. Set in establishing residential communities that are just completely Chinese, completely Japanese, and autonomous from American culture, American language, American customs. All legal, all according to the law. Everything's purchased with money. Mutually agreeable exchange. It's registered. Every taxes are paid in additionally. And in doing that, that process establishing itself as independent municipalities according to state law, whether it's initially a township or a village or a city or otherwise, all per the requirements as is stipulated by the law today, the American law as it stands today. And in doing that, in purchasing the land, establishing the municipalities, now we're getting the honks now. Honky honk. It's honky talk. Honky talk. Honky talk. Anyways, it's establishing independent municipalities, and in establishing independent municipalities, independent police forces for those municipalities, townships, or whatever. Even establishing counties, entire counties that are owned by China, that are owned by Japan, that are owned by France, that are owned by Kenya, that are owned by Nigeria, that are owned by Ethiopia, that are owned by the African Union, that are owned by Arabia, that are owned by Qatar, entire counties. And in those entire counties, wow, we're growing already. We've grown from municipalities to counties. Entire county seats. All the cities in that county all the administrations, all the town councils, not even having necessarily town councils, don't need to necessarily. The forms of governments, honky honk, the forms of governments within each of the locations being established in different ways with different emphases according to the pretenses and prerequisites of state law, but different from the norm of other municipalities. County by county. Establishing villages, communities, school systems that are independent from state boards of education, that are independent from federal standards, don't need testing. This is independent schooling, don't need accreditation. And otherwise, that's okay. Don't worry about employment. We got places for kinfolk to work for life, to be supported for life in the county itself, or otherwise, or otherwheres. Don't worry about that. We don't have to worry about education in terms of credentials. Children are being educated properly. Don't have to worry about university degrees per se. And if so, could study someplace else. Is visas going to be a problem? Is travel to and from going to be a problem? We can talk about that as it occurs. Meanwhile, purchase. Build. And in doing that, the political structure of the United States changes. The political blocks, the business as usual, done changed. All legally. People got bank around the world. Easy. And there's incentive for doing it in the United States in this process of transformation as the United States is falling apart, bursting or decaying at the seams. Blocks with bank buying up and building, setting up shop according to the law, because the law is built on take. So either you change the law and don't be take, or get took, because the obstruction ain't sustainable. Can't hold off the world. You are the world. You can't hold it off. So that's a legal scenario. Buying up counties. The African Union. What up, Africa? No way. A coalition. No way the UN would allow that. No way the United States would allow that. Would China allow it? Would China provide some kind of balancing leverage to keep the United States from flexing and telling everybody who they can be and what they can do in their own land in terms of sexual deviance and otherwise? Could India do that? Could Arabia do that? Qatar? Or whoever else is coveting what Africa has to share? Say, hold up, United States, nah. Remember this thing you did over there? Yeah, quiet up before that becomes known. So sure, African Union can buy up a county. Why not? Buy a few. France, England even. Oh, dare not England. Why not? Then state legislatures change. The blocks of politics change. The gerrymandering changes. It's not necessarily for the best, for the better either, particularly in the near term. It could be the even worse corruption, even worse callousness, and otherwise. There's no guarantee. So we're not advocating this. We're just communicating what the actuality is. There is, just to be honest, there is the advocacy of fairness and justice, which is being obstructed by America at this moment. And so there is that bias for fairness, shall we say. But it manifests itself in a number of ways. This is one. And as the United States obstructs or endeavors obstruction of that methodology, it avails itself to expedited overthrow, and we're not advocating this, but that's just one way of describing it, overthrow through other ways. So that's the first one. Another one is, how did we say? I said 4, yeah. Well, another way is just militaristic, and that's just nasty. We don't advocate that either. But that's another premise. I mean, again, just looking at the unscrupulousness of the world, just like we got hyenas sniffing around here. They're hyenas that sniffing at the United States, and looking at where the weaknesses are, where the opportunities of exploitation are. And if America is being particularly belligerent and obstructive of foreign, quote-unquote, entities doing things in a legal way, that provides for the motivation of doing things in a further contentious way. And that can be finding pretenses for invasion. OD. That's unthinkable until it happens. Like Katrina or Flint, Michigan, or 3 Mile Island, or otherwise. OD, what's he saying with that? Anyways, continuing on. We want to go to sleep now. This tired. It's a long day. Now we don't have to check the energy, but we do have to check the storage. All these things. So, yeah, and we are getting at that point already. All right. So the second scenario is like, amidst the belligerents, other communities, other foreign entities that have abilities and leverage and strings and whatever else, finding parcels to do little incisions, and in those little incisions, that like this, the infrastructure, the governing infrastructure is just so spoiled, corrupt. I'm trying to think of that like physiological term. When a body is decayed, like, anyway, all right. I'm trying not to be emotive, and I'm not trying to conjure, and I'm trying to be, all right, as unthinkable and unfathomable as that may seem. It's actually extremely rife for doing. And the thing about it is that as impervious as the United States seem at this moment of anything entering the land and doing anything against the military or otherwise, don't even think about it. Here's the thing. Amidst that unthinkableness, that unthinkableness, when you actually think about it, once that wall is breached, it all falls. Everything is so volatile, politically, even economically, socially, the fabric within society, neighbors living amongst each other. Just that initial piercing of occupation from a foreign entity, a UN peacekeeping force, to intervene in a domestic disruptive condition, maybe in a fringe municipality on borderlands or coastlands or whatever else where occupation is further feasible. Militias involved. Atrocities witnessed. The United States can't force itself or pimp talk itself out of it. It's not even an option immediately. Obviously backed by particular competitors in the world scene, but maybe led by further diplomatic, neutral, friendly nations, even NATO itself. Yes, okay, fine. We have to recognize we have to intervene here. It's too much. Just that one, even that one precedent opens it up, the floodgates, within and from outside. The floodgates of similar responses to similar upheavals, the floodgates from within of just, oh, yo, here it is. This is the end. All right, here we go. You got your stockpile? Yeah. All right, here we go. What people have been preparing for generations, at the bit, on the ready, trained for that scenario, and easily seeing just a small precedent of occupation from a foreign entity being the spark that just sets everything up. And at that point, it's huge, absolute, I won't say absolute, huge, unrecognizable change, even unfathomable change, very quickly. Because that's how things are at this moment. I'm not trying to be Malcolm X talking about a powder keg, because the conditions, we're not talking about domestic conditions, we're talking about international conditions. And we're talking about woeful decay, where things are at the moment. So that's the second scenario, the militaristic, and we don't want that. We don't advocate that. But again, in the gangsterism of the United States, recognizing the gangsterism of the world, and with the United States being further belligerent and not proficiently powerful to do that. That's the second thing. Third thing is, third thing is somewhat related to that in terms of, well, it's kind of like a varied version of the second joint state. So in the second joint is primarily the foreign occupation, and like a gradual increasing and then a systemic presence of foreign entities, foreign militaries, UN peacekeeping forces occupying segments of the United States. And the way I describe it there seems even further implausible, but it's actually favorable compared to the other category, which would be the third, somewhat variance of this one, which is just like the domestic civil war. And that's different from like the occupation scenario, because the Civil War is just like the interior, like explosion of the United States, that has been threatening itself for a long time already. And all right, so that's the third scenario. Now we'll get to the fourth scenario. And this is like where the crux is, because this is what is happening already at this moment. The self-annihilation by suppressing, well, I guess the fifth scenario, and maybe one of the fourth ones or whatever else, but the fifth scenario, which is the most favorable, and I guess we're skipping four for the moment, and we're going straight to five. We'll go back to four to describe it. So the fifth scenario is actually the United States being proactive and facilitating the healing, facilitating the change, proactively either diluting itself, dissolving itself, or minimizing itself, and abstaining from the obstruction from within and from outside, to do things in a healthy way, to be proactive. That's actually the favorable way, but it's so implausible amongst all the other scenarios that didn't even, I forgot to share that one. So that's scenario number one, I guess. Scenario number two is like allowing business as usual for the world to take over the United States. That's scenario two. Scenario three is foreign entities eventually arriving on the pretense of peacekeeping, because they sniff the opportunities of conquest, or at least of leverage and competition, and so utilize a certain situation or a certain incident as a pretense for occupation, and that's setting off a chain reaction and things falling off accordingly. The fourth scenario is basically civil warfare within the United States, and in some ways, I don't want to talk about it like that. So, but all right, that's the fourth scenario. The fifth scenario is what is readily manifesting at this moment, and that's just like the increasing corruption to the point of like robotic unrecognizability. ED. So here's what we mean by that. What's happening already, again, is self-annihilation, and it's happening through a number of ways. One of which is LGBTQ and sexual deviance and corruption asserting itself as the norm and as a governing phenomenon within conventional society. It's powered significantly by science and academia, but it's not necessarily powered by academia. It's powered, it's, how do I put this? It's infused within academia, and academia is like the boundary of apartheid within society. It's a huge filter between the upper class and underclass. So LGBTQ is infused significantly within the hierarchy of academia, particularly because academia is a cesspool of sexual exploitation. And so it's naturally attuned with LGBTQ as sexual deviance. Deviance, ANCE. And so because of that, the LGBTQ is significantly aligned at this moment with the gatekeeping of the underclass and the overclass. And because of that, and because of how much academia is basically a pretense for the governance of the United States in terms of policy recommendations and otherwise, LGBTQ is increasingly influential in the policy, flying flags, rainbow swastikas, and additionally at city halls and further. So, in that scenario, for the traditional kinfolk, traditional family kinfolk, and additionally, who can't stand people who look different, who can't stand people who believe different, because of that refusal to work together, are contributing to the decay of the social fabric of society, because the sexual corruption and the sexual deviance uses that divisiveness to ascend and assert itself as an authoritarian construct. And that sexual deviance, the LGBTQ, is intrinsically and increasingly ethnically and religiously diverse. So because the traditional families of different ethnicities and different religions refuse cooperating with each other, refuse respecting each other, refuse letting each other live in a genuine and prosperous way. Because of that, it's contributing to a social decay within the fabric of all of society. Social decay, the decay of family, the family relations, the decay of neighbors, the decay of villages and village experience, the decay of relationship itself within American society, because of the families and communities refusing to live peaceably and respectfully with each other. And in that decay of the social fabric, at the moment, sexual deviance is ascending above the social fabric to be governing factors, to determine to be determining authorities, quote unquote, that decide policies, government policies that are enforced by police and even the military. When the rainbow swastika is flown outside of the White House, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. That's part of the current consequence of the refusal of Africans and Europeans and Mediterraneans and Jews and Muslims and Chinese and native kinfolk peaceably and respectfully working with each other. Because of that, LGBTQ has ascended into the governance and is determining the policies, the public policies of education, of residence, where people are living, of economics, even who's getting jobs, who's getting funding, and additionally, which further deteriorates the experience of traditional families. So it puts again the overclass underclass binary, the reduction of the middle class, and the moderation, and the further desperation people have towards being in the overclass to be further divisive with each other, as long as they're not part of like the outcast group. And so in that scenario of desperation, the LGBTQ is able to pick and choose further who is allowed into the to overclass, and it picks families that are broken, where the father is out or father is on the way out. Children are vulnerable for manipulation and indoctrination and sexual deviance and otherwise. It's happening at this moment. And the thing for you to be honest, racist, xenophobic bullshitters, whoever that applies to, is to recognize that LGBTQ may at the moment be considerably homogenous in terms of European kinfolk, but to recognize that part of the culture of LGBTQ is very much diversification. It has to be in order to exist. And that's to talk about that is a lot of other details, but just understand LGBTQ has to be diverse, particularly because it's a world phenomenon. And in its semblance of like the whole methodology and strategy of alliance, allyship, and all this other intersectionality and all these other kind of buzzwords, there has to be a facade, an aesthetic of diversity. And it does its best to recruit okie doke kinfolk of other ethnicities who are just going to be assimilated and just like shells. But increasingly, because the nature of LGBTQ is not specific to any particular ethnicity, the people of other ethnicities have greater credibility within LGBTQ as a pretense or as a propaganda, because it's all corruption and it's all selfishness. But as a semblance of credibility, the people who are from underclass, quote unquote, ethnicities, and there is no underclass ethnicity, that's all part of the domestic plantation mentality. But in that mentality, which is shared by the mass of society, the people who experience affliction, particularly along the lines of ethnicity and religion, have greater credibility within LGBTQ, which is why LGBTQ needs that. And as LGBTQ becomes further established within the hierarchy of society, it becomes increasingly ethnically and religiously diverse. It has to be literate, it has to be functional in terms of addressing the ways of different communities, and thus, one way or another, you are being governed by different ethnicities, and it's going to be, well, one way or another. And the further you work against it, the worse it is for you, is basically what we're saying. Because when you work against each other and refuse allowing others to be even just independent and be themselves, you allow the corruption to ascend and assert itself over you. And you might perceive that corruption being favorable because it looks like you at this moment, but you can already see there is a Beijing going on in that corruption. And that is positioning itself to govern you at this very moment. It is establishing laws and additionally. And you might think, well, as long as you can live in that upper class scenario. But understand that that overclass scenario is still subordinate to a further corruption that is increasingly ethnically diverse. LGBTQ is simply a part of it. So that's another scenario. That's one part of that scenario, is the sexual deviance and the sexual corruption being increasingly authoritarian over all families and further deteriorating the fabric of traditional families because the families refuse to cooperate and even just respect and allow each other to live. That's already the facts. That's already happening. And it's just being amplified at the moment. When you refuse China to arrive here and be traditional families, when you refuse India or Japan or anybody else to set up shop, to set up villages with traditional families, and additionally, you are investing in political machinery that amplifies and expedites the sexual deviant authoritarianism over yourselves. Do you see that? Does that make sense? That's not it, though, because you already know further what's going on with these assassination attempts. What's going on with these school shootings? It's the manifestation of that, of the death eyes in the children who don't even know enough about life to believe in life, because the parents are so dishonest and corrupt. If they're not exploiting their children directly and immediately, the children just see the deceit and corruption and are very fearful, are very angry at the prospect of life itself and having to live that way. And thus, after being bullied and devalued, after bullying and devaluing others as a way of trying to like get some of that angst away from oneself, because they see what's going on in their own house. After they do that, and after kinfolk who experience the same thing receive that bullying and that ostracization and vilification, decide to do something about it, and then shoot up the school. So you're seeing the manifestations of the selfishness, the greed, hatred, delusion, the obstruction, the disrespect towards others. You're seeing the consequence, the manifestations of that in the sexual deviant authoritarianism that's increasing. I won't say exponentially, but significantly. It's actually on the wane now, because there's a limitation of that too. But the waning of that actually precipitates the invasion of the perceived foreigners. But to be honest, part of the precipitators of that limitation of the LGBTQ is kinfolk such as myself that call LGBTQ out for what it is, are less, I'll say, further courageous in withstanding the blowback from the LGBT community to this day, by the grace of the Most High, who are woefully honest, and all the accusations, and additionally even the setups, multiple setups and attempts and endeavors, false court summons and other things, because we do what we do and we call it out for what it is. LGBTQ hits a threshold of how much it can get over on others. LGBTQ shows its ass in how it does manipulation and dirt, gangsterism against others. All that subtle passive aggressiveness becomes further visible. So even if police can't do it, because police are employed by sexual deviants and cannibalists, and the politicians ain't going to do it, children increasingly do it, the youth increasingly do it, foreigners increasingly do it, the spiritually woke increasingly do it, and counterbalance the authoritarianism of the sexual deviants. ANCE. But in that process, it's very expensive, and there's increasing intrinsic subjugation to foreign entities that are called upon eventually to arrive as established institutions of authority that promote traditional family and that are a relief and a support to your children and to your youth who you are not protecting sufficiently at this moment, who you are not providing for sufficiently at this moment, who need protection and support and guidance beyond what you are providing. And it don't matter what color, what ethnicity, or even what religion that guidance, protection, and support comes from. And you have less of a choice and less of a say when you keep ignoring it. So, the authoritarianism of the sexual deviance is one scenario that is reaching its threshold, to be honest. But the effects of that, just like the daylight, still is warm even after midday. That's where things are in that respect. And there's little what we can say in terms of what that looks like in the short term, like in the next few years per se. There are a lot of things that are happening at the moment. We're just observing this and staying true to our lane and our position in this life and in this civilization and what we're called to do. We don't hate LGBTQ kinfolk. We love LGBTQ kinfolk, and as we've said for years, many years, all LGBTQ kinfolk are going to heaven. We don't even see that as even like that's not even a lot of the propaganda, or a lot of the messaging from the LGBTQ community is extremely different today than it was 20 years ago. It was very much a victim trope 20 years ago about anti-vilification, anti-bullying. And again, during that time, the loud voices were coming from religion, in addition, that were condemning LGBTQ kinfolk woefully. And it was easy to see LGBTQ kinfolk as victims. And so the trope from that time, from the LGBTQ kinfolk, is along those lines. And that's easy to support. But now, what we see is, get along. Authoritarianism. You better like it or whatever, we don't care. Wow, like that? So that plays itself, and it's showing itself increasingly. It's playing itself, and it doesn't care. It's flexing, and it's doubling down on its flexing. And it's flexing on light. It's the rainbow swastikas flexing on light. Plain and simple. And it's showing itself. And it has this sense of impunity because it has leverage and the scoop on different potentates, the landowners, and additionally, aside from just being the landowners oneself, it has a sense of impunity. But in that hubris, there is a vulnerability, because in showing itself in its tactics, its hostilities, its lies and deception, false accusations, obstructions of healthy relationship, hating on families, recruiting youth, condoning pedophilia and sex trafficking. The youth see that. The children see that. And further solutions manifest naturally, organically, by the divine grace and will of the Most High Elohim, beyond all the plots of the powers. So I'm getting into hype talk at this moment, but anyways, parents, we encourage you to be courageous and honest, to be modest, to focus on what your basic needs are, to recognize what your basic needs are, what the basic needs of your children are, what the basic needs of our children are, what the basic technology needs are. Have strength not to just pander to your children because of compensating for your guilty complex and guilty consciences that you don't want to address. And your children and youth know that and use that against you to be further corrupted within this earthly life. Be courageous, to be disciplined and modest. steps in this direction, and encouragement of your children to be modest and to focus on healthy methodologies of valuing oneself, of being satisfied, finding purpose in this life, finding one's talent and skills, and devoting attention and efforts on a regular basis towards cultivation of those talents and skills, to hone a vocation, a craft, a service of healing for others, to be supported for continually in life, and to be in healthy relationship with another as spouse, husband and wife together, and bring new life and share those ways with new life. It is doable, it's accessible, it's step by step, but it requires step after step, and it requires letting go of the poisons, the pollution, the unnecessities of the moment. So that's kind of skipping to the solution thing that we haven't even scheduled. So again, the scenarios of like the eventual multiculturalism of the United States officially, pervasively. One is proactive and not obstructing people of cultivating healthiness, providing devoted spaces for people to be healthy, for villages, families, tribes, clans, nations, confederations being healthy, fresh water, clean soil and land, clean air, to proactively establish that. That's the first scenario. Second scenario, what we say, allowing the world, according to the conquest laws of the United States, allowing the rest of the world to conquest as well. We don't advocate that, obviously, but that's one of the free market methodologies of approaching the harmony. So that's the second scenario of just allowing China to buy its own counties, allowing Japan to buy its own counties, the AU to buy its own counties, the European Union, France, España, Deutschland, Scandinavia, England to buy its own counties and set up shop and just like flow with the foundational change in politics and economics, and additionally and not be the monopoly of the theater of the United States. That's the second scenario, and those are both comparatively peaceful, less static. It allows you to focus increasingly your resources, and additionally set your prices, set your price that you want, and use those resources and use that lessened, like not worrying about those particular locations as much. Use that attention and those resources to invest within the domestic conditions of the places that are still within your theater of authority. That's the second scenario. The third scenario we say is invasion from foreigners. Finding one vulnerability within the shield, and then the floodgates. That's the third scenario. The fourth scenario is just civil warfare from within, just something sparking, and then it just like multiplying. That's the fourth scenario. And the fifth scenario is just like the status quo of not doing anything and just standing by and watching the corruption manifest itself, and the decay manifest itself, and the takeover manifest itself, fast or slow. And in that scenario, as we mentioned, there's the sexual deviance that becomes increasingly authoritarian over even yourself and your children, all our children. Then, in addition to that, simultaneously, there is the violent outbursts, unpredictable per se, unscripted, outside of the theater, uncontrollable, beyond control of conventional authority, and being increasingly the culture of chaos, causing uncertainty within the psyche of people, and all the while becoming increasingly ethnically and religiously diverse. The sexual deviance becoming increasingly diverse, the eventual ethnic ambiguity and androgyny of the LGBTQ culture, and the culture and authoritarianism of sexual deviance. That androgynous beige, for better and for worse. That's on one side. Then the flip side is the violence. The violent deviance manifesting itself beyond the prognostications of conventional authority and fueling dissonance between communities, and the necessity of inter-heritage international reconciliation, international councils for reconciliation, and additionally. So now we've been at this at an hour at this point. That's basically what we have to share. Don't even at the moment don't even think about what we started with, because too fatigued to render those memory mechanisms. Was there something else supposed to share though? We've shared a lot already. We shared what the solution is before: nature, rivers, languages and calendars, song, stories, rituals, and ethics. Supporting that. What we consider at the moment, I'll just throw this in there since we're at this. One of the things we're looking at in terms of being proactive without necessarily being unduly provocative, but we're understanding this further, like what the actualities of the moment are. I'll just say what it is and how much the necessity of explaining at this moment. We're not specifically planning this at the moment. This is something that is in deliberation. It's this: going to a municipality. We've shared things before, as in terms of invitations and solicitations and trying to do things by the books, but here's what we're talking about now. Going to a municipality, particularly one within the immediate vicinity. And we're working on the details of this, but just going up and directly asking, face to face, person to person, as much as possible, as much as kinfolk are willing to sit with us. But we are this group, Rastafari, multicultural, mixed heritage. We abide by these principles, Panchasilas. We're about this code of peace and cooperation, one love. And that being said, here's some materials about us. Here's some of the work that we do. If you need some further anecdotal testimony about our work, here's a list of references who we have not contacted beforehand, who we are involved with in doing this piecework, so that you have some substantiation of the claims we're making. And with all that being said, here's what our purpose for sharing this with you at the moment. We articulate a scenario, and after articulating the scenario, we ask you what you consider to be your response. How would you respond to this scenario? The scenario is we identify a park, a public park, and we set up residence in that public park. Ongoing long-term residence, self-sufficient residence for our families. Modest, not taking over everything, not being belligerent, but living here. With the prospect of establishing organic agriculture and building some modest infrastructure, like buildings that can weather the seasons. So, in that scenario, what would you do? How would you respond to that? Would you threaten us with violence and removal? Would you let it play out for a while and then threaten us with violence and removal? Would you let it be? Would you actually provide incentives and investment for the effort? Contribute facilities, perhaps? What would you do in that scenario where we do this? That's what we are considering at the moment, and seeing how the municipality responds. Because what we recognize is that it's not a matter of getting pre-approval. We've worked for that for a long time, and even when it becomes so woefully obvious how beneficial it is, not necessarily that particular scenario that I just described, but in other ways, when it becomes so woefully obvious how beneficial it is and how woefully unresponsive and like dissuasive the conventional kinfolk are, what we recognize is that it's a matter of, and this is part of the culture and the de facto law of the United States. Again, take. It's just a matter of not necessarily taking because we can't own anything, but just setting up shop, squatting, and being proactive without permission, without pre-approval, and then seeing how the response is. One of the challenges with that is that the response can be very violent. It can be very hostile, particularly given what people's politics are already without us doing that. So that's one of the concerns. And in a hostile response, what effect that has, whether it's actually death or whether it's like significant, like lock up for a long time that keeps us away from doing other work. And I'm 50 years old, still have yet to be married, and like the prospect of being locked up for another year or another 2 years, that's serious business right now. So, we've done the squat thing before, and we've gotten that situation of being locked up for a few months for doing that. We tried sending communications, and additionally, as a preparation and negotiation, alternative, mutually agreeable solution. But this one, it's a matter of directly approaching. We can be off the record or whatever. We don't have to write about it or whatever. Just go directly, talk, say, yo, we do this. What you gonna do? And we see what we do accordingly afterwards. It's not hostile. It's not a threat. It's legitimate. There it is. And we can pose that to a number of municipalities. It depends. We see. But then we make a decision about how we proceed accordingly. We might do that. We might go public first. To be honest, we could go in recording just because the process, the history, the track record, is one of just avoidance, even to this day. In recent occurrences, it's a dismissive kind of avoidance. So, kinfolk are much further responsive in one way or another. Either in showing themselves or in being willing to cooperate when beginning with a recording. So we see how that is. There it is. Now we conclude. We give all thanks and praise to the Most High Elohim. Blessed love and peace and Rastafari.